You are listening to Exopolitics Today with Dr. Michael Salla, your source for the uncensored truth regarding the human, extraterrestrial, global, and political agenda. Click the like button and subscribe to this channel. And now, here's Dr. Michael Salla.
So now we get to phase two. So even though Kennedy tries to get to the bottom of the UFO issue through using his authority as president and issuing memos and tasking Dulles and trying to dig into Cold War psychological operations and what they were doing regarding the UFO issue, at the end of the day he didn't get anywhere. So phase two, Kennedy was commander-in-chief, which meant that he had unrestricted access to any military facility in the United States or beyond. So Kennedy would use that authority. Here you have a photo of Kennedy speaking at Andrews Air Force Base in November 1961. So Johnson I think that's Johnson. But anyway, so he's there at Andrews Air Force Base. So he begins touring Air Force bases, military bases, and uses his authority to find out if there's anything concerning UFOs, extraterrestrial life, that exists on that base. So Kennedy continues to gain access to UFO information using his authority as commander-in-chief. So despite Dulles's, the CIA, MJ-12's rebuff to Kennedy, Kennedy used his authority to find out about UFOs. So he visits military facilities housing extraterrestrial artifacts, and allegedly meets twice with a famous contactee who passes on extraterrestrial information, and even arranges a meeting between Kennedy and ET. So I'll discuss both of those issues. So firstly, visiting military facilities. So around 1961-62, President Kennedy expressed a wish to see alien bodies associated with an alien crash site. He had obviously been informed of their existence and wished to see for himself the evidence. According to information received, the alien bodies were taken to Florida, where Kennedy went to see them at a medical facility. So that's a quote from Timothy Good, Need to Know, citing some whistleblowers, some credible sources, that was saying that Kennedy was actually actively trying to find out where the extraterrestrial artifacts and the alien bodies were being housed. So Kennedy visits Homestead Air Force Base in Florida, and apparently that is one of the bases where the extraterrestrial bodies and alien artifacts were housed. And we know that because later on President Nixon arranged for his good buddy Jackie Gleason to accompany him on a visit to Homestead Air Force Base, where he showed Gleason some of the extraterrestrial artifacts. So we know Homestead Air Force Base, according to different sources confirming that Nixon took Jackie Gleason with him to Homestead to see the alien bodies, that Kennedy knew something was at Homestead Air Force Base. Some bodies were there. So here's a picture of Kennedy arriving at Homestead Air Force Base in November of 1962. So Kennedy did travel to these places where there were these bodies, these artifacts. So we don't know how many of them he visited. I mean, that's all kind of like murky, but we know that he did see these things. Now, one of the things, and if you wanted more details, my book, Kennedy's Last Stand, I cite other sources talking about Kennedy having this information. But I wanted to kind of like move quickly to get through all of the material we have to cover. So this takes us to Marilyn Monroe, Kennedy, and the UFO issue. So Monroe was with the Kennedy brothers she had these affairs with the Kennedy brothers, and she was told by the Kennedys, especially John Kennedy, about UFOs. And so here's a picture of Monroe with both Kennedy brothers after the president's, on the evening of the president's birthday party on May 19 of 1962. And Kennedy had an affair with both of the brothers. When the affair with John F. Kennedy came to an end, because he was warned by the FBI that Monroe was a security threat, he was warned off. So Kennedy, rather than breaking the news himself, thinking that Monroe would react very badly, he sent his brother, Bobby Kennedy, to break the bad news. So Bobby Kennedy broke the bad news, but said, hey, here I am. And apparently she and Bobby Kennedy had an affair. So goes the story. And there's sources kind of like suggesting that that is exactly what happened. But nevertheless, Bobby Kennedy himself was told he needed to cut his relationship with Monroe because she was a security threat. She was associating with people having suspected communist links, especially tied into the Castro regime, and that the Kennedy administration's efforts to assassinate Castro, and there were many of them, many efforts to assassinate Castro, that Monroe could have learned about them through Kennedy and kind of like spilt the beans. So she was a security threat. So Monroe, Kennedy cut ties with her, and so Monroe was furious over it. And so then she began to threaten to give a press conference where she would tell everything about what had happened. So there's a CIA wiretap document that was signed by James Jesus Angleton, the CIA's chief of counterintelligence. Very important person to keep in mind, and I'll be coming back to him. But his signature appears on this wiretap document. It's dated August 3rd, 1962, one day before her accidental death. Angleton's CIA counterintelligence was monitoring Monroe and also UFO events, because in the wiretap document it discusses Monroe's knowledge of Kennedy's visits to classified military facilities where he saw UFOs. So Monroe knew about it and was going to give a tell-all press conference. So that's on this document. So let me magnify that or quote from the document. This is what the document says. The transcript states, Rothberg indicated in so many words. Rothberg is someone that's in the entertainment industry, and he was associated with Dorothy Kilgallen, who was a good friend of Marilyn Monroe. She was a British socialite. She'd written a number of books, so she was very knowledgeable on UFOs, on Kennedy, on and a good friend of Marilyn Monroe. So the CIA was tapping the phone calls between Monroe and Dorothy Kilgallen, and Rothberg, Sidney Rothberg, I think it was. He was a press agent. So Rothberg indicated in so many words that she, Monroe, had secrets to tell, no doubt arising from her trysts with the President and the Attorney General. One such secret mentions the visit by the President at a secret airbase for the purpose of inspecting things from outer space. Kilgallen replied that she knew what might be the source of visit. In the mid-50s, Kilgallen learned of secret effort by US and UK governments to identify origins of crashed spacecraft and dead bodies from a British government official. Kilgallen believed the story may have come from the New Mexico story. So this CIA wiretap document is a bombshell. It's telling us that Monroe had confided to Dorothy Kilgallen, who was having conversations with her press agent Sidney Goldberg, about what Monroe had told her, that she had told Kilgallen the president was going to these military bases and he saw the UFOs, and the UFOs actually were associated with some of these crash retrieval operations that were known to have occurred, and that Kilgallen had learned from her own British sources that both the US and the UK governments were working together to recover these spacecraft and to reveal what was going on. So very important. That's a very important document. And of course, Monroe dies one day later. That's August 4th, 1962. She died very mysteriously, and there are a number of sources that say that it wasn't an accidental overdose. She was actually murdered. The CIA was involved. And also Robert Kennedy visited her twice on that day to beg her not to go forward with the press or with the reveal all press conference, and he wanted to get her little red diary. Apparently, her red diary was the evidence she was going to present at this press conference, saying, "Here it is in my red diary. President Kennedy visiting alien bases. This is what he told me on such and such a date." And so Robert Kennedy was fingered as having visited Monroe twice on the day that she was killed. And in the book Kennedy's Last Stand, I explain that I think Kennedy was set up by the CIA in a sting operation, so that he thought he was trying to get her, he was trying to pressure her to hand over the red diary, but in fact one of the people with Kennedy that was administering a drug administered a lethal overdose, as opposed to something that would just sedate her so that Kennedy could take the red diary. Okay, so now we're going to get to the claim that President Kennedy actually was given informal briefings about UFOs from the leading contactee at the time, George Adamski. Now, George Adamski, a very famous contactee, maybe many of you haven't heard of him, but he became famous in the early 1950s because he was able to rig up a camera to his telescope, and he was able to get these really clear photos of these cigar-shaped craft with flying saucers coming out of them or going into them. So here you have a series of 4 photos from that era, from March 5, 1952, showing Adamski, showing photos taken by Adamski of these of this cigar-shaped craft that had flying saucers leaving it. So now there's a question mark as to whether or not this was an extraterrestrial craft, or could it have been a German craft? Interesting question. I don't know the answer to that. Everyone who has followed the Adamski case closely associates it with extraterrestrials, with Venusians, but that could have been a cover, because the Venusians themselves look very Germanic, very Nordic, and Adamski's initial contacts with them suggest that they could well have been part of a German program out of Antarctica that had then relocated on other planets and was pretending to be extraterrestrials, that this was part of the agreement. But nevertheless, Adamski's photos have never been debunked to this day. They were taken in 1952, well before Photoshop, and there were many other photos he took. Now, I think Adamski was very credible. I think he was telling the truth. These are some of the best flying saucer, cigar-shaped photos that have ever been released. Adamski says that he was regularly briefing the Pentagon after his ET contacts, and flown from California. He was having his contacts in Los Angeles, and after his contacts he would drive off into the desert he would have his experiences, and then he would be flown from by jet from Los Angeles to the Pentagon and give a briefing about what he was told. Adamski had a US government ordnance card which gave him access to secure military facilities, and that was verified by others. So, there are a lot of people that debunk Adamski, says he was a liar, hoax, but it wasn't true. I mean, he was someone that had photographic evidence. He had lots of witnesses that saw the craft with him, that signed sworn affidavits. So Adamski had a lot of evidence. So don't believe the debunkers out there that say, Adamski had no evidence. He had a lot. It was all debunked, because in those days, people believed in, if the FBI said something, it's like, that's it. That's the truth. Well, now we know better. So he had a lot of evidence. And Adamski had a government ordnance pass card, which gave him access to secure military facilities. And two people saw the ordnance card and said it was authentic. One was William Sherwood, who was an optical physicist at Kodak, and he previously worked at the US Ordnance Department, and he recognized that, this is valid. So how can Adamski, who was a World War I veteran, have in 1952 a government ordnance card that gave him access to all military facilities in the US? Clearly, he had that because he was doing exactly what he was saying. He was having contacts with extraterrestrials, and after every contact, he would get on an Air Force jet, be flown to Washington, D.C., and brief the Pentagon on the contacts. Here's another great photo. This comes from it's a still shot from a video that was taped in 1965 in the presence of Madeleine Rodefer, and she was a secretary at the Pentagon. She also saw Adamski's ordnance card and knew it was the real thing. She actually got to meet with some of the Venusians, or the extraterrestrials, that Adamski was in contact with. So Adamski is a really good case to be familiar with as we move into this new era where there's a lot of revelations coming. So this is a scout craft that was photographed by Adamski at Madeleine Rodefer's home. And if you look at that scout craft, its shape, it is an exact match for the German Hannibal II that were the schematics of which were leaked in 1991 by Vladimir Tuzinski. So definitely Adamski and the people around him were having experiences with the occupants of flying saucer craft, whether they were extraterrestrials with a base in Venus, or whether they were Germans out of Antarctica pretending to be extraterrestrials from Venus. I mean, that's an open question. I don't have the answer to that. It could be a combination of the two. But nevertheless, this Adamski is an important contactee case. So Adamski claims that he confidentially visited Kennedy twice in late 1961 and 62 and passed on communications from his ET contacts. And I think that's not only plausible, it's probably logical, exactly what happened. Think about it. Adamski's having contacts with extraterrestrials throughout the 1950s. Adamski had an ordnance card that gave him access to military facilities in the 50s so that he could get on jets and be flown to Washington or conduct briefings there at that whatever facility he was at. So I think it's very logical that, given his position, that Kennedy was briefed by Adamski twice, exactly as Adamski said. Adamski did regularly brief VIPs around the world. I think Prince Philip in England, the Dutch royal family. He briefed Pope Pius, Pope John, I think it was at the time, and Pope John the 23rd, I think it was. So Adamski was someone that was briefing high-level people that wanted to know about the extraterrestrials. Well, what are the extraterrestrials telling us? Or, these people claiming to be extraterrestrials, what are they telling us? So apparently Kennedy met with Nordic extraterrestrials at an undisclosed Air Force base that had been arranged by Adamski. So this was apparently where Adamski's contacts yielded fruit in terms of him being able to pass on information to Kennedy. And some of that information was very important. And this is something that Adamski has said, and I think it's very, very plausible that that information concerned a crisis that the United States was going to enter into in 1962, which the Nordics, the extraterrestrials, warned could lead to the end of life on the planet. And that was the Cuban Missile Crisis. So according to Adamski's information, the Nordics had given Kennedy a warning a year ahead that there was going to be a world crisis, and the world would be on the precipice of nuclear war, and they gave him advice on what to do. So the Cuban Missile Crisis, that happened in October of 1962, and this was something that was a very important event. So Kennedy was getting informal briefings from contactees like Adamski, may have even gotten to meeting, he may have even met with some of these extraterrestrials, as Adamski claimed, at these facilities, remote facilities. So this really kind of wraps up the second phase of Kennedy's efforts to get to the bottom of the UFO issue. So now we're getting to the third phase. This is the one that brings to culmination all of the things that had been building during President Kennedy's administration, all of his knowledge and his efforts to get to the bottom of the UFO issue and to assert presidential control. So we get to this point by September of 1963, after having exhausted all of his different attempts to find out about the UFO issue. President Kennedy goes to the United Nations and gives a major speech. It's traditional for a president to go to the UN in New York to give a speech before the General Assembly, ranging over a number of issues of international importance. But a part of President's speech spoke about something that really goes to the core of what I'm going to be talking about now. So I just want to play that for you, and then we'll be back and discuss it.
The United Nations 18th General Assembly, which opened in an unusually hopeful atmosphere, hears a message of interplanetary importance from President Kennedy, who arrives with Ambassador Adlai Stevenson. Mr. Kennedy hails the pause in the Cold War, then he makes a startling proposal.
Finally, in a field where the United States and the Soviet Union have a special capacity in the field of space, there is room for new cooperation, for further joint efforts in the regulation and exploration of space. I include among these possibilities a joint expedition to the moon.
So there you have a really important speech, and his offer to the Soviet Union to cooperate on joint space missions and joint moon missions probably comes as a surprise to many. I'm sure very few have heard of that before, and which is really very significant because this came just 2 months before the assassination. And what people don't know is that the offer to the Soviets to cooperate on space, a lot of people don't know that that offer was made, and they don't know about the Soviet response. But what we can cover is the response by Congress and NASA. The reaction was like, at best, lukewarm. People weren't excited by this idea of cooperating with the USSR, the evil empire. I mean, people had been socially indoctrinated into believing the Soviets were evil, the communist dictatorship. And so how could the United States trust them to cooperate in space and share our most valued secrets? And some even thought that this was treason. keep that in mind. In September of 1963, many people began to believe, we're talking about people on the extreme right here, anti-communists. My father was an anti-communist, and I'm sure this sort of thing would have appalled him, the idea of cooperating with the Soviets. He and so many others would have said, no, don't cooperate with them, don't trust them. There would have been fervent anti-communists in the United States national security apparatus that would have seen this speech by Kennedy as treasonous. Keep that in mind, because later on I'm going to talk about someone who began monitoring the back chatter amongst those alt-right groups that saw this idea of cooperating with the Soviet Union as treason. Keep that in mind. So anyway, the public response by the Soviet Union is silence. They don't give any response. They're caught off guard. Khrushchev, the leader of the Soviet Union at the time, Nikita Khrushchev, a reformer, definitely someone that wanted to reform the Soviet Union and get away from the dark days of Joseph Stalin and the repression. And unfortunately, Khrushchev's time would not be that long in office himself, because he would suffer a similar fate to Kennedy, but not as quickly. But I'll talk about that later. Privately, Nikita Khrushchev is silent. Sorry, Khrushchev refuses. That was the initial response from Khrushchev. So despite opposition from the national security apparatus, the lukewarm response from Congress, from NASA, despite the Soviets rejecting his offer, Kennedy still persisted in his effort to have the Soviets accept. So what changed? September, Kennedy makes the offer. Everyone is aghast, either lukewarm or outright, this is treason. And Khrushchev himself declines. What happened? Khrushchev finally accepted Kennedy's offer. This is a part of history that people don't write about, don't talk about it. A vitally important part of American history is totally ignored. Kennedy assassination researchers don't talk about this because they don't understand the significance of space cooperation with the Soviet Union, joint missions to the moon, how that could have in any way factored into the Kennedy assassination. It was all about the mafia and betrayal and Cuban exiles that hated Kennedy and wanted to get back for betraying the Bay of Pigs. That's where a lot of the Kennedy researchers focus on. The truth is this, is a historical event that gives us a deeper understanding of what it was that Kennedy was doing that was a threat. Because remember back when I was talking about the assassination directives, the 8 assassination directives, what is it that threatened the existence of the CIA? Sorry, what is it that could have threatened the existence of the Majestic-12 Group? Because that's what they were worried about. They were focused on UFOs, reverse engineering. They were worried that Kennedy was a threat to them. And they came up with this set of directives. One was an assassination directive in case the climate in Washington was hostile and threatened the existence of Majestic-12. Well, the Bay of Pigs didn't threaten the existence of Majestic-12. Mafia being betrayed didn't threaten the existence of Majestic-12. What is it that threatened? And even the people talk about the executive order 11.11.0, where Kennedy authorized the US Treasury to come up with silver bullion that could be traded under the US Treasury rather than the Federal Reserve. They say, well, that's it. That's why Kennedy was assassinated. He was going against the Fed. That's it. So, no, that's not it. That's part of it. Something that he was doing that threatened the existence of the Majestic-12 Group. None of those things threatened the existence of Majestic-12. But space cooperation with the Soviet Union threatened the existence of cooperation, threatened the existence of the Majestic-12 Group. And why? I'll explain shortly. So Khrushchev's son said that on November 11, 1963, his father finally accepted Kennedy's offer. Khrushchev said, live in an interview, in the weeks after the rejection, his father had second thoughts. Why did Nikita Khrushchev reverse course and accept Kennedy's September offer for joint space and lunar cooperation? Why? On November 11, 1963, the Cosmos 21 failed to leave low Earth orbit. It was supposed to be a mission to Venus, and it malfunctioned and orbited around the Earth for a few days and then just crashed back on Earth, and the Soviets were tremendously embarrassed. It was like a setback. And Khrushchev thought, well, you know, we can continue to do this, or we can cooperate with the Americans and get to the moon together. So he accepted. So Kennedy sprang into action immediately afterwards. One day after Khrushchev accepted, one day after the Cosmos mission failure, he issued National Security Action Memorandum 271 on November 12, 1963. This is an official document that was declassified. So this is an official one. So what does he say in this official document that was addressed to the national, to the administrator of the national, to the national administrator? I would like you to assume personally the initiative and central responsibility within the government for the development of a program of substantive cooperation with the Soviet Union in the field of outer space, including the development of specific technical proposals. Okay, so he's telling the NASA administrator to start sharing substantive information, technical proposals, details in terms of like the construction and the power of the Saturn V rockets, of the Apollo mission, of exactly what was going on with Apollo. What was happening with Apollo? An interesting question in itself. Kennedy wanted to share all of that with the Soviet Union, with Khrushchev. You can understand a little bit now why some people would have been really, really upset about this, that this was a threat. Treason. Get to that soon. So this is an unclassified document. It continues. These proposals should be developed with a view to their possible discussion with the Soviet Union as a direct outcome of my September 20 proposal for broader cooperation between the United States and the USSR in outer space, including cooperation in lunar landing programs. So there Kennedy explicitly connects his September 20 speech to the United Nations with this National Security Action Memorandum. Cooperation with the Soviet Union was Kennedy's answer to get to the bottom a lot of stuff that was going on in space. He wanted to share data. He wanted NASA to share data with the Soviet Union, which would in turn share data with NASA and the President and the State Department and others. And we see that at the bottom of the circulation list on that National Security Action Memorandum, where it includes different US agencies and departments that would be involved with NASA in cooperating with the USSR. You have the chairman of NASA, the Secretary of State, the Secretary of Defense, the Director of the CIA, Chairman of the Atomic Energy Commission, Director of the National Science Foundation, Special Assistant to the President. So the President's office, his Special Assistant for Science and Technology, would be part of the loop. They would all share information on joint space and moon missions with all of these agencies, which this was clearly an end run around the CIA, the MJ-12 group, to cut Kennedy out of the loop of what was going on with UFOs and space operations. Now, this is the one that is the bombshell. This is a Majestic document. It came out on the same day as National Security Action Memorandum 271, November 12, one day after Khrushchev had agreed. Kennedy wrote off a letter to the CIA director, John McCone. Top secret memorandum to the director, and the subject header file was classification review of all UFO intelligence files affecting national security. Kennedy was referring to UFO files affecting national security. He wasn't referring to UFO files of no national security that were being sent off the Project Blue Book, which was a public, which was something to just kind of like throw a veneer of credibility to the Air Force's efforts to look into the UFO phenomenon, but in really it was doing nothing. It was just a public relations exercise. Project Blue Book was public relations because it dealt with UFO files that had no national security. Kennedy, in this memorandum, is saying UFO files that have a direct effect on national security are to be shared with NASA. And as a consequence, it would go on to sharing that with the Soviet Union. So in this memo, Kennedy says, I have instructed James Webb, the director, the NASA administrator, to develop a program with the Soviet Union in joint space and lunar explorations. It will be very helpful if you would have the high threat UFO cases reviewed with the purpose of identification of bona fides, as opposed to classified CIA and US Air Force sources. So Kennedy is saying that he wanted the CIA director to share all classified UFO files with NASA. That would, as a consequence of the agreement with, as a consequence of National Security Action Memorandum, then pass on those files to all of these institutions, including the President's science advisor. So this is really incredible. This memorandum, it's something that has been researched as part of the Majestic documents by Dr. Woods and his team, and I believe that they give it a medium to high authenticity rating. But when you look at associated documents around it, you can take this one to the bank. It goes on, when this data has been sorted out, I would like you to arrange a program of data sharing with NASA where unknowns UFOs are a factor. This will help NASA missions directors in their defensive responsibilities. I would like an interim report on the data review no later than February 1st, 1964. So there you have it. He wanted the CIA Majestic-12, the Black Dragon, hoarding its golden eggs of UFO secrecy. It wanted it to share with others. Don't be greedy. Share the good, the abundant, the gold eggs. Share with everyone. Share with NASA. Share with the State Department. Share with the Pentagon. Share with the Department of Energy. Share with my science advisors. Share with the National Security. So share with the National Science Foundation, and share with the Soviet Union, and they'll give us their bag of goodies. Everyone is going to be happy, right? No, we're going to see that. People weren't happy. Look at the date. I would like an interim report on the data review no later than February 1st, 1964. Kennedy had a plan. February 1st, 1964, just after a week after his second term of office would have begun, he would have gotten this report, and he would have been in a position to officially brief the United States, Congress, the general public, and the world about any of the information that was being shared. This was the end run. This directly threatened the future of Majestic-12. This was the thing that couldn't be allowed. Take note of that handwriting. We'll come back to that. The handwriting on that document, very, very significant. But I'll come back to that. So Kennedy had a disclosure plan. There was also a hotline conversation. Another MJ document is allegedly a top secret NSA intercept of a hotline conversation between Kennedy and Nikita Khrushchev. Again, November 12, 1963. A lot of circumstantial evidence that that day there was a lot happening. Kennedy sprung into action. He had been waiting for this moment, because this was much, much more than just Kennedy wanting to work with Khrushchev and the Soviets on joint space missions and lunar landings. Kennedy was doing an end run around the CIA, around the MJ-12 Group, to get all of these national security files concerning UFOs, reverse engineering, and what the Germans were doing in Antarctica to start sharing that information. He wanted all of that to be shared. And all of this was done on the basis that he wanted to avoid future conflict, that he was saying that we needed to share this data, classified UFO data, with the Soviets to avoid the risk of future conflict. So this was all part of the hotline conversation that was held, and that occurred on November 12, 1963. Now, was that possible? Was there a hotline even in existence at that time? Well, it was. The US-USSR hotline was installed in August 1963. Now, conventional historians will tell you that, that was never used, wasn't used for about another 10 years. No, the hotline document, which is a Majestic document, says no, it was used. It was used only 3 months later, in the November 12 conversation between Khrushchev and Kennedy on the sharing of the UFO files as part of the agreement. Hotline conversation, more on that. Kennedy, I've begun an initiative with our NASA to exchange information with your Academy of Sciences, in which I hope will foster mutual concern over this problem and hopefully find some resolution. I have also instructed, he's there, referring to National Security Action Memorandum 271, and he goes on, I have also instructed our CIA to provide me with full disclosure on the phantom aspects and classified programs in which I can better assess the UFO situation. So Kennedy is telling Khrushchev that, look, he's been cut out of the loop on the UFO issue, and he's wanting this agreement with Khrushchev to open up all of these classified files. So, what's the authenticity of this hotline conversation? Well, there's a lot of circumstantial evidence. The National Security Action Memorandum issued on the same day, which is an official document that was declassified. The memorandum to the CIA director, which was a leaked document that has a medium to high level of authenticity according to Dr. Wood. The failure of the Cosmos 21 mission on November 11, 1963. Sergei Khrushchev's revelation about his father's acceptance of Kennedy's September 20 proposal. In other words, all this was happening, and the American public were never told a damn thing. I mean, that should make everyone angry. Makes me angry. Why weren't we told about this? This is part of our history. Part of the deception. Part of the lies that we've been given for decades now. Critical events were happening during the final 2 weeks of Kennedy's life, and we haven't been told a damn thing about it. All we've been given, all of these conspiracy theorists talking about the magic bullet, talk about the logistics and the trajectory of the magic bullet that killed Kennedy, and whether Oswald was on his own. Ignoring all this stuff, saying this is nonsense. UFOs are nonsense. You have these documents, you have these events showing conclusively that Kennedy and Khrushchev were working together to share files on classified UFO issues that would have broken open everything and shared it across the spectrum of agencies, national security agencies and entities in the United States and similarly in the Soviet Union, and broken apart the control of the Majestic-12 Group that had hoarded all this information. So space cooperation with the USSR would ensure that classified UFO files would be widely shared amongst US institutions, and I've mentioned that list, including the Office of the President, the Special Assistant to the President for Science and Technology. This would have been the closest thing to disclosure if this happened. Because once this kind of information dissemination happened amongst the official agencies, public disclosure would have been assured. JFK did have a disclosure plan. February 1st, 1964, after he would have been given that review of classified UFO files that the CIA would have shared with NASA and with all of the other entities and with the Soviet Union, and then getting from the Soviet Union their information about UFOs and what the Germans were doing in Antarctica, Kennedy would have been in a position for a graduated disclosure plan. And I think that's precisely what he was doing. MJ-12 wouldn't allow it. This is why Kennedy threatened their existence. And this is why they went forward with their plan. So the handwriting on the Kennedy memorandum, I referred to that earlier. That top secret memorandum that was issued on November 12, 1963 to John McCone, it goes to John McCone's office, director of the CIA. What? What's this? Classified UFO files of national security significance? What's this? I don't know anything about this. Who knows about this? Someone would have tapped him on the shoulder. Maybe you should ask that guy, William Colby. He's in charge of the Far East Asia division of CIA's clandestine services. I think he knows something. So, McCone gets in touch with Colby, William Colby. Hey, what's going on with this memo? Colby says, oh, don't worry. Angleton has MJ directive, dated November 20, 1963. So that handwriting tells us that in response to Kennedy's request to share classified UFO files, McCone is saying, well, what do I do? He's being told, oh, don't worry about it. Angleton has something called an MJ directive, and everything's being looked after. 2 days before the assassination. James Angleton and the MJ-12 assassination directive. William Colby is acknowledging that James Jesus Angleton, 2 days before Kennedy's assassination, had MJ directives and was using them to respond to Kennedy. So the handwriting directly implicates Angleton in the Kennedy assassination due to the cryptic MJ-12 assassination directive project environment. So Colby knew that Angleton was the guy that had the treasure chest of golden eggs that the CIA and the MJ-12 group was hoarding of MJ-12, of classified UFO files, reverse engineering programs, what was going on in Antarctica with the Germans, the agreements, the secret agreements, all of that. What's true, what's not, what's this information, what's not. All of that, all of the secrets. This was the guy that was hoarding it all, Angleton. This is the smoking gun documentary evidence of an assassination plot. You have the top secret MJ-12 directive that was drafted sometime in September and then passed in October of 1961. Project environment. When conditions become non-conducive for growth, it should be that cryptic reference that conditions in Washington are non-conducive for growth. This is talking about what Kennedy was doing on November 12 by issuing these directives and these memorandums and conversations with Khrushchev. The weather in Washington was hostile to Majestic-12. The secrets are going to be taken away from them. And who knows? Kennedy would probably have abolished Majestic-12 and followed through on his threat to splinter the CIA into 1,000 pieces. And then you have this top secret memorandum written to John McCone on November 12, 1963. And the handwriting. Angleton has MJ directive. What directive is he talking about? There are 8 directives. One of the directives was a cryptic assassination directive. Kennedy's dead 2 days later. I think it's pretty clear that the final go-ahead to assassinate Kennedy, we are seeing it right in front of us. That's the draft. That's the top secret memorandum to John McCone. That's the smoking gun evidence that an assassination directive was being implemented. So now we get to what has more recently happened that gives us more of an idea of what was really behind the Kennedy assassination. Well, from July 2017 to April 2018, the National Archives released 53,000 JFK assassination documents. So this was one of the things that I mentioned earlier on at the beginning, that President Donald Trump, that he requested that these files ought to be released after the 50 years had elapsed, authorizing their classification for national security reasons. And the CIA wanted to keep that secrecy in place. They didn't want these things declassified. But Trump said, no, let's declassify them. And so they were released in various batches, beginning in 2017 through to 2018. I think the first batch was April 2017, and then through to 2018. July 2017 to April 2018. 53,000 documents. Now, some of the, they're very revealing documents, but there's one in particular that I really want to focus your attention on. This is an army cryptologist. Let me move over here, this side. So this is Eugene Dinkin. So he learns of a plot, and so he was stationed in Meta, France. So he learned about a plot from data dating back to September 1963, where JFK is accused of being weak on Russia. Army superiors ignored his data. So Dinkin wrote to the Attorney General Robert Kennedy, warning him about JFK's upcoming Dallas trip, that an assassination was being planned. Now the thing is, what happened in September of 1963 that was being picked up by this army cryptologist? He was picking up chatter that pointed to an assassination plot against Kennedy. It's something that happened in September 1963. So what happened in September of 1963? Kennedy's speech at the United Nations, where he's talking about cooperating with the Soviet Union on space and lunar landings. That was in September. Some people viewed that as treason. People on the far right, rabid anti-communists, saw that as betrayal, as treason. So they began to conspire. And this army cryptologist, Eugene Dinkins, picked up the chatter, and he wanted to warn Kennedy about what was happening. So he writes a letter off. He tells his army superiors. They ignore him. He writes a letter. He writes a letter to Robert Kennedy, telling Kennedy, "Dear Attorney General, I don't know what the letter was, but something to the effect, "Dear Attorney General, there's a plan to assassinate your brother on his upcoming trip to Dallas, Texas. There are people conspiring." This happened in early November. This happened around November 4, November 5. Then Dinkins travels to Geneva, Switzerland, goes to the headquarters of the United Nations, looks for the international press and says, "Hey, I've discovered a plan to assassinate President Kennedy. My superiors aren't listening to me. I've written a letter to the Attorney General. I haven't heard back. Kennedy is going to be assassinated before he goes on his upcoming trip to Dallas." That he's picked up data pointing to that. One newspaper wrote a story about it, but it was ignored. After Kennedy's assassination, Dinkins was then sent off to a psychiatric ward of Walter Reed Hospital. I mean, he probably would have suffered a nervous breakdown. I mean, just naturally, but I assume that was not so much to care for Dinkins, it was just to silence the guy. Here's a guy that warned of an assassination plot, a conspiracy dating from September 1963. Remember that date? It's in Dinkins' document, September 1963. That's when he traced the chatter for an assassination. It was ignored. He was institutionalized. The CIA withheld Dinkins' story from public release. The Warren Commission ignored it. Warren Commission, headed by Alan Dulles, the wolf guarding the hen house. And 1976, the House Select Committee on Assassinations also ignored Dinkins' testimony. And the CIA arranged for his files not to be released. So here you have, included amongst the documents that were declassified by Trump, you have a document here showing release to the public, dated May 19, 1964. Should we release Dinkins' testimony to the public? These are CIA officials associated with the Warren Commission. Release to the public, yes or no? Guess which box they ticked? Okay, so we're getting the picture now. They're covering up. And Dinkins wasn't alone. There was another Army cryptographer. This guy was stationed at a top secret CIA listening post where he also heard chatter about an upcoming assassination plot. This is another document that you can find online where it refers to Christensen. He was also committed to a mental institution. He had foreknowledge of the assassination plot. These people's testimony was ignored by the Warren Commission, by the House Select Committee on Assassinations, and the public never learned about it until we had these this 50-year dump of Kennedy assassination documents, 50,000 documents. I mean, who can sort through all of that? It's going to take ages. So this was nothing less than a covert coup. The assassination directive represented a covert coup by the MJ-12 Group that, through CIA counterintelligence, had the means to deny any president access to classified UFO files and even forcefully remove uncooperative federal officials. They arranged it. All the pieces match up. There were a lot of people that hated Kennedy. I don't doubt it. Cuban exiles hated him. The mafia hated him. A lot of people felt betrayed by Kennedy. Reneged on deals. But the thing that really brought it all to a head was his September outreach to the Soviet Union to cooperate on space missions. And then November 12, sending out those memorandums. That was MJ-12 through its asset in CIA counterintelligence, James Angleton, taking action because Kennedy constituted a threat to continued MJ-12 operations. So the Byrne memo and the CIA memo directly implicate MJ-12 and the CIA counterintelligence in the assassination. Lyndon Johnson, a major factor in the JFK's assassination. People have written about that. There's a lot of data. Roger Stone's book, I definitely recommend that. I mean, the case against LBJ is pretty compelling. He was an MJ-12 asset. But not only was he involved in the assassination of Kennedy, but he was also involved in the assassination of James Forrestal in 1949, Kennedy's mentor, for doing pretty much the same thing that Kennedy was doing in 1963. So you have a parallel here between what Forrestal was doing in 1949 to get the truth out, and then how he was committed and then murdered, to Kennedy being assassinated in 1963. And LBJ was involved in both cases, prominent part. I think LBJ was MJ-12's hitman. I mean, he was definitely an operative, an asset, but I think he also organised the hits. Because why would he have gone in to see James Forrestal at Bethesda in 1949? I mean, Johnson had just been elected to the Senate. He was previously a serving congressman. What possible interest would Johnson have in visiting a former Secretary of Defense that was institutionalized for a nervous breakdown at Bethesda Naval Hospital in 1949? He was there because he was under orders from MJ-12 to give Forrestal a warning. Shut up or you're dead. Simple. Forrestal ignored the warning. Kennedy ignored the warnings. And we know the price both men paid. Okay, so now we're getting an idea. Well, what happened afterwards? What was the aftermath of all this? This coup, MJ-12 Group, initially it had 12 people, 4 from the defense establishment, 4 from the national security establishment, the intelligence agencies, and 4 from the science establishment. 12 people, Americans, 12 Americans sitting in MJ-12. What happened afterwards? Well, MJ-12 was internationalized. There's a really important document here from the Majestic documents that gives us an idea of what was going on. This is from one of the sources, is called S1, that came out on July 7, 1999. Robert Wood hasn't found enough to authenticate this fully, so he gives it medium authenticity. But I think when you look at similar comments by others like Ben Rich from Skunkworks and Corey Good, I think it's accurate. I think it's exactly what happened to the Majestic-12 Group. So what happened to the Majestic-12 Group after the Kennedy assassination, after the coup, after all of these people in the MJ-12 Group were implicated in the death of President Kennedy? What happened? Well, this memo, or this letter actually gives us an insight. It says, now I want to fill you in on some things regarding the special studies and conclusions by the defunct MJ-12 Group. So he says it's defunct. Okay, it's defunct. So what's replaced it? A, MJ-12 does not exist as a government intelligence entity. It ceased to exist in 1969 and became a private concern financed by big money and big science. The group has been called by many things. The most recent one was used in 1992 and was identified by the name Jehovah. At one time it was called Zodiac. It may have changed in 1995. The UFO / extraterrestrial biological entity working group is an international consortium financed and supported by some of the biggest money institutions and private industrialists in the world. Think James Bond. I mean, this is like MJ-12 at the end of the 60s, whether by shame, whether by design, was expanded or dissolved into this international consortium. involving American, British, German, other major companies that were all involved in the study and reverse engineering of extraterrestrial technologies for building secret spacecraft and for reaching agreements with extraterrestrials. So now it's not an American group that's in control anymore. It's an international consortium. And there are other sources that talk about this international consortium and how it's taken power away from any one nation and its national security officials and internationalized it all. Okay, so now we get to the whole Fourth Reich connection. So how does the Fourth Reich connect to all of this? I've mentioned it here and there. So there's one of the documents that was released in the document dump by the National Archives in 2017 and 18 was this Hitler document. And it says that, quote, Similarity 3 was contacted on 29 September 1955 by a trusted friend who served under his command in Europe. Similarity 3's friend stated that during the latter part of September 1955, Philip Citrion, former German SS trooper, stated to him confidentially that Adolf Hitler is still alive. And they even provided a photo of Hitler in Colombia. Citrion indicated to Similarity's friend that he took a picture with Hitler not too long ago. On September 29, 1955, the photo was shown to Similarity for the purpose of getting his reaction to the possible veracity of this fantastic story. So the question is, why would a Hitler document and a photo showing Hitler in South America, why would that have been part of these JFK assassination files? What's the connection between Hitler, Nazis, escaped Nazis, and the Kennedy assassination? Is there? I mean, this is the implication of having these files classified with the Kennedy documents for over 50 years. Well, there's been a number of sources that talk about Hitler going to Argentina. There's a book by Harry Cooper, The Documented Truth, lots of compelling data showing that Hitler did indeed escape to Argentina. Then you have a book by Jim Mars, a former colleague of mine, who wrote a book, The Rise of the Fourth Reich, talking about this Fourth Reich, talking about an international consortium that had arisen that was taking control of the planet. International consortium, where have I heard that before? Or where have we heard that before? Of course, MJ-12 was replaced by an international consortium. Somehow this was the outgrowth of those initial agreements that had been reached during the Eisenhower administration between the US national security apparatus and the German program in Antarctica. So I write about that at length in the Antarctica's Hidden History. So it talks that book goes into detail into the international corporations and the cooperation that was formed between them that became the basis of this Fourth Reich. And what we see from the Majestic documents, the assassination of Kennedy, is that the agreements with the Fourth Reich happened in the 50s. In the 60s, you have a very strained relationship with Kennedy. And then the abolishment of MJ-12, or MJ-12 being absorbed into this international consortium involving Germans, Americans, Brits, and others that wanted to decide the future of the planet in terms of how much of this advanced technology should be released. So there's major industrial production of flying saucers, secret spacecraft in the German secret space program out of Antarctica. Large quantities of personnel and resources are given to the German secret space program as part of the agreement reached with President Eisenhower. This raises the question, did JFK threaten to expose end or alter the agreement. By exposing everything that was happening in terms of classified UFO files that would have opened up what was happening in Antarctica, maybe even exposed the existence of this German secret space program throughout the US military, throughout the national security system in the US. This is something that Kennedy could well have been doing, could well have been his plan. Now, the Apollo program itself that Kennedy implemented, I think he understood that this was something that was controlled by the Fourth Reich. He was very familiar with what the Germans had in Antarctica. He just wasn't up to date on the most recent information. But based on his earlier history, he knew a lot about it. The Apollo program was run by the Fourth Reich. People think, okay, Apollo was run by Americans, and sure, you think about that. James Webb was the NASA administrator. But no, the Apollo program, not NASA, the Apollo program was run by Nazis, was run by the Fourth Reich. Werner von Braun was the director of the Marshall Space Flight Center from 1960 to 1970. He was the guy that was in charge of designing all of the rockets that would be used for the Apollo program. The Saturn V rocket, working with all of the major aerospace companies in the United States to build the rockets and the landing modules and the different stages for the Saturn V rockets and Titan rockets and others that were associated with the Apollo program. He was in charge of that. Werner von Braun. Here's von Braun with Kennedy at Redstone Army Arsenal in May 18, 1963. Now this is important. Look at this photo. Kennedy walking alongside Werner von Braun in May 18, 1963. Now earlier on I showed you a photo of Kennedy before the grave site of James Forrestal. That happened a week before this meeting. Kennedy was getting ready to confront the Fourth Reich, I believe, and say, hey, you've got to put me you've got to put me into the loop here. I've got to know what's going on. I've got to make the right decisions here. I can't be kept in the dark. I think they kept it from him. So there's Kennedy von Braun. Von Braun, a former Nazi SS officer. So here's Richard Hoagland and Mike Barra. Quote, von Braun during World War II was nothing less than a major in the SS. Linda Hunt found survivors of the Nazi missile factories at Metalwork and Peenemünde who told her that von Braun not only witnessed executions and abuse of witnesses at these facilities, but on at least one occasion ordered executions. So von Braun was a Nazi. Of course, he was rehabilitated in the US and by the US media as a hero, as the man that pioneered the Saturn V rockets that got Americans to the moon. But really, was that what Apollo was about? Here's another Nazi, Dr. Kurt de Bus. He was the guy that was in charge of, he was the director of the Kennedy Space Flight Center from 1962 to 1974. Another former Nazi, Nazi SS, no less, an officer in the Nazi SS. No doubt a rocket expert, but how could this person be put in charge of the Kennedy Space Flight Center? This is where they actually launched the Apollo rockets, the missions to go to the moon. They were all under the control of this Nazi. And it wasn't just a matter of, you have one Nazi at the top. At the Marshall Space Flight Center, that was known as Fourth Reich headquarters. I mean, William Tompkins says that he went there to Marshall Space Flight Center in 1961 to pitch a proposal for the design of the launch facility at the Kennedy Space Flight Center. And he says that as he was driving up, he saw a flag, an American flag with the stars replaced by the swastika. this was the Fourth Reich headquarters, because the Marshall Space Flight Center, you had von Braun at the top, but you also had all of these German scientists underneath, filling all of the key positions. And so this was actually, the Apollo program was a front for something else. Apollo program was a cover for funding the German Antarctica secret space program. And in my book, the US Air Force Secret Space Program, I go into more detail about this. And I say, quoting myself, while Apollo got Americans to the moon, it got the Antarctic Germans to Mars, Alpha Centauri, and beyond, end quote. So the Apollo program was a cover. Lots of money, lots of resources was going to building the Saturn V chemical fuel, liquid-propelled Saturn V rockets that would take Americans to the moon. Vast money and resources were going to that, manpower was going into that. But even more was being funneled through the Apollo program down to Antarctica to help the Germans develop their space program so that they could get to Mars, Alpha Centauri, and beyond. And Americans would get breadcrumbs in terms of the reverse-engineered anti-gravity craft that the Germans were using for interplanetary and interstellar spacecraft flight. Americans were getting the breadcrumbs, and they were happy to do this. Create the Apollo program as a front for this information exchange and resources. So if you want to get more details on that, go to that book, the US Air Force Secret Space Program. So I think Kennedy's plan to share classified UFO files with the USSR threatened to expose the US-German Antarctic Agreement. So the question is, was this a factor in JFK's assassination? We know that the Majestic-12 Group felt threatened by Kennedy, that the assassination directive that Dulles put together back in September of 1961 explicitly referred to when things in Washington DC are not conducive to growth, that a hit could be conducted on whoever was the problem. Kennedy was a threat. So MJ-12 wanted him out of the way. They got the CIA counterintelligence chief, Angleton, to implement the decision, to the assassination directive. As for the Fourth Reich connection, I'm not clear on exactly what role they played in this. It's just an open question. What role did they play? An interesting question to pursue. Okay, so that is the presentation. I recommend Kennedy's Last Stand, the book that will cover the history, the prehistory of Kennedy, and a lot of the documents that I've mentioned, the Majestic documents. You can find that in that book. You can get it on Amazon, and actually there's an audio book version which will be coming out soon as well. And then there's the Secret Space Program book series, where I talk about the different reverse-engineered space programs that have been developed by the Navy, by the Air Force, by the German Antarctic program. I'm currently working on another book which is going to go into the CIA NRO's secret space program, because the NRO has a secret space program, and that is something we need to know about, and how all that relates to Space Force. So that is going to be the future book. So thank you all. I wish you all the best, and aloha.
You have been listening to Exopolitics Today with Dr. Michael Salla. Please remember to like, share, and subscribe to this channel. Join or start a conversation in the comments. Take the time to explore the vast library of best-selling books, webinars, and podcasts by Dr. Salla. Visit exopoliticstoday.com.